Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond. This is episode number 54 of the Web Platform Podcast. Today on our panel we have Justin Ribeiro.
Hello, wonderful people.
Dan Buchner.
Hey.
Danny Blue.
Hey, everybody.
And myself, Erik Isaksen. And today we're going to be talking about web components, and we have three awesome guests. We have Rob Eisenberg.
Hey there.
And Wilson Page.
Hiya.
And Chris Heilmann. Is that correct pronunciation?
Yes, for a change it is, yeah.
Sweet. So can you guys introduce yourselves in that order, I guess?
Okay. My name is Rob Eisenberg, and I am the project lead for Aurelia, which is a next-generation web front-end framework. And obviously we're doing a lot of work with, maybe not obviously, but we are doing a lot of work with web components and surrounding technologies. So we're very interested in the future of where that's going.
Hi, my name's Wilson. I work at Mozilla on the Firefox OS project. We're using a lot of web components in production, and I've been involved in a few of the spec discussions. So yeah, I'm excited to see where they go.
Hello, I'm Chris Heilmann. I'm from Microsoft. I work on the Edge team, and I've been running a panel on web components at the Edge conference the other day, and then wrote an angry article about how the state of components is, which partly inspired what's going on here.
Yes, I love that article, by the way. It was really good, because then I read the one that you wrote a long time ago, where you were saying praises about the web components.
Yeah.
And it was really, I wanted to get people together because I know that a lot of people are like, oh, I don't want to start playing with web components because there's a lot of hype. Some people feel like some larger companies are pushing it down people's throats and forcing it. And I wanted to get like a realistic perspective on things to see where we're at and where we're headed, and things that we've learned from the past that we should really fix now. So, with that said, what are your thoughts, Christian?
I was kind of disappointed by the state of it, because it was partly a configuration of things. Like when we started with web components, we said like, okay, here's a video element in a page. What is actually all these things? What are these buttons? What's going on there? And we wanted to make people aware that this is also HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and that features in the browser are actually built this way. And then we said like, oh, why don't we extend the browser that way? Why don't we allow for widgets like tab groups and these kind of things that are not specified in HTML, and have a full lifetime span of like initializing that, sending that, and going out of it. And now we're at a stage where we're like, yeah, this is halfway through after 4 years later, after it's been 2 years later, after it's been said like this is the thing we need. We're still at a stage where it's like, okay, you need these 12 libraries to make it work, and the difference between different browsers is holding us back. And then we started like, instead of having HTML imports where we build web components and import them like you would include a style sheet or you would include a script, we now say, okay, we need E6 modules for that, which is a different spec altogether and a different kind of thing altogether. It's not markup based. It's like out of a sudden the simplicity of what we wanted to do with web components became a thing. Now you have to be a JavaScript expert as well and have to do it in JavaScript rather than just put an element in your page. So I thought we lost a bit of the original vision of web components, and we got far too excited about componentizing everything, which reminds me of larger platforms like .NET or Mono or even PHP includes that we had in the past. So I think we're losing a bit of focus of what we want to achieve with web components. And I think when it comes across browsers, we're still far too far away from being able to use them without the aid of React or other platforms.
So you mentioned something there which is actually a big sticking point for me personally, which are HTML imports. They in their current state, well, partially it's support, right? So all the browser vendors getting behind what imports are. And I know I've talked about it before here about some inherent issues with the way that imports work, just the semantics of it. And I think Aurelia actually, Rob can speak to that obviously much better than I can. I think they actually have a different syntax. So like you can't there's no naming of something that you import, because an HTML import can be anything, right? It can be CSS, there can be JavaScript in there, there's obviously HTML, but with this dream of building, tens of thousands of components, and people get to import all these things, you're going to run into naming collisions. And right now there's no good way to achieve right now there's no good way to handle that. And imports, it just throws everything on page, and whoever gets there first gets it. So do you think that maybe fixing isn't the right word, but maybe like getting everybody more on board with imports will help go towards that, back towards that original vision?
Yeah, I think the problem is that we have with JavaScript as well. If you have a function with one name in another script that's the same function, the second one overrides the first one. And I think the other problem, of course, with HTML imports was performance, because they were all synchronous rather than asynchronous. So that was another thing to fix in this case. I think it's better off with imports, but as I said, do we actually, by using the thing that makes much more sense in terms of like technical clarity, do we push the entry point far too high? Like should people know about all kind of ES6 before they actually use a web component, or should they just be able to use a component by writing an import? I think the import and custom element feature was something that was very natural to somebody who writes HTML. But then again, the question is, do people still write HTML, or are we past that stage by now?
Yeah, I mean, that brings up a good point. The big push today is to have all of these preprocessors and build steps, and compilation and transpilation is sort of like required now. And I mean, imports in particular too. There's some issues with those as far as that goes, because we have the HTML, not the HTML, the ES6 module loaders, and my understanding is that if we were to implement them tomorrow, right, you couldn't do any of these custom elements. They couldn't register themselves, right? And I think that's why they're in the head. Am I correct in that?
They would still work correct. Is it because the modules are loaded asynchronously?
Exactly, because it's my understanding was it was synchronous.
It's an interesting point, because right now that does work. You can lazily instantiate components, so you could have an xfoo tag on the page, and then at the end of the body, like, you could have something that loaded the definition of that component, and it would work. But this is something that's being spoken about, and was spoken about heavily in the face-to-face last week. So the end goal is to align custom element definitions with ES6 classes. And that would involve having all your instantiation logic inside the constructor instead of the created callback. So that would mean that as the parser hits the tag, the element would get it would get created straight away, instead of what happens today, where the parser hits the tag, it becomes some kind of weird halfway. It's not an xfoo. It's just something that's not defined, some HTML element, and then it hits the register element later on in the document. And then the prototype gets swizzled, which is the term that's being used, whereby the element then becomes something different, and then the created callback gets called, which apparently developers don't have much of an issue with, but the platform devs and spec people really hate this, and they want to explain the platform and say, hey, the video tag's created with all its logics in the constructor, and it gets created at parse time, and the end goal is to try and have custom elements do the same.
Yeah,
but apparently it's super tricky.
That second pass is something that I remember, I remember talking about that 2 years ago. That's the exact same flow, and kind of the devil that is both choices, because you really want to get the stuff out there, but then you don't want to make it rely on all these other things. And I'm curious, now that ES6 is out there, does everyone here on the panel feel that that's still an issue? Now that it's ES6 is close and we have polyfills, I don't know what a polyfill would look like. It'd probably look a lot the same as it does today. But is that still a concern, or what do you think?
Isn't that slightly the crux of the whole thing? The problem with the template element, for example, is that you cannot polyfill it. The idea of a template tag is that it doesn't do anything when JavaScript is not available. But as a browser that doesn't understand the template tag would still render the content of it as an invalid element. It would just say, like, okay, I don't know what it is, I just show it to you. So you can't even polyfill that because you cannot just override it because it gets rendered on the first flow. It's supposed to be inert content. And inert content has never been defined in the parser before, except for a script element with a type that isn't defined. That's how we did the templating before the template element. So the whole concept of like having a custom element in there and then having the custom element definition overriding what it is in essence just progressive enhancement of a div element and making it something else. Like it's you will have a flash of unstyled content, all kind of problems with that one. Whereas like a video element gets rendered when the page encounters it, and it's not becoming a placeholder and then becomes a video element. So when in the runtime this becomes the functionality is the question there. And I myself, I don't have a problem with that. The other thing, of course, is like when you say ES6 is ready, it's like, yeah, it is, but where it is on runtime. Most of the time you have to use a transpiler to use ES6 as well. So making the components dependent on the availability of ES6 in the browser is another interesting loop that's going on. But a much more to me, a much more interesting one because, for example, iOS 9 Safari has a good ES6 support, but I don't know what its support of like web components is at all. So I think the push with ES6 across browsers is going much faster than the one that we had with the web component spec. So maybe that's the right way of doing it.
Yeah, they only support template currently.
Yeah,
it's actually been Apple that have been pushing the hardest for the alignment with ES6 on custom elements. So it's interesting that they want to see that fixed. But then, so I don't think they're happy with the upgrade, the lazy upgrade thing that we have right now. So it seems like that if we did go with synchronous constructors, we would need something to say, or the user would need something to say, hey, by the way, my element definitions have now loaded. Can you please take a second pass? And they'll do the upgrade manually or something funny like that. But
can I talk a little bit about? So my perspective on all this is a bit different because I'm actually a framework author building on top of these specs, and a number of the things that we've built with Aurelia actually has to do with addressing pretty much all these issues on top of the existing specs. So, and it's actually hard to talk about them because there's these different specs but they all sort of tend to relate. Problems with one are problems with another. But so the element upgrading issue, for example, one of the things that we do is we use HTML imports, but that's only but the actual load of our views is also passed through an ES6 loader. So we kind of patch things up to try and merge them together, and we have this pipeline for anything that we're importing into that allows us to scope what is being imported into that view. So we sort of solve the scoping issue, but what also gets solved as part of that as well is that we basically have this way of speaking sort of web components terminology instead of our specific terminology. We have this way of knowing when, say, a template is ready to be instantiated. And so if I were to imagine this in terms of web components, it would be the ability to import things not just into the document, but into a template, and then to ask a template when it's ready to render. And at that point, you then have the ability to synchronously actually instantiate everything that's in that template. So this is actually what Aurelia does behind the scenes. Is you build your app in terms of these views. Individual views can import what they need, and when a view is parsed, we determine its dependencies, asynchronously load them, and that all happens before at some point down the line a synchronous instantiation of that view happens. And so I'm wondering maybe there's some way that we can in the specs have this synchronous instantiation of templates that allow the synchronous constructors to work, but maybe to let a developer say like maybe they designate that some fragment of their DOM has some scope to it, and it has its imports in it. So because there is this issue of you don't also want to delay the entire rendering of a page to wait for all the web components to run. So we've got that issue in your traditional apps as well. So maybe most of their view is maybe it's standard HTML, but maybe what they can do is tag certain parts of their view as asynchronous, and then the imports can load asynchronously, and then once the runtime knows that those pieces have loaded, it then can synchronously evaluate that fragment of the DOM. This is kind of off the top of my head. It's handled entirely different with Aurelia, so we don't have these issues. But maybe
yeah,
that's the way.
That sounds like a pretty good solution. And I think if you think of it how you use JavaScript today, like, and you're using, say, require.js async loader, and you want to use some function from a module, like, you're not going to try and call that function before it's been loaded. So
Right.
I think developers do kind of have that model in their head already, that, like, hey, I've got to wait for this thing to be loaded before I use it. So the upgrade prototype swizzle thing is cool because it's a bit more robust. But maybe it's going to introduce a lot of corner cases that frameworks and stuff are going to have problems with. So.
Do we feel like with frameworks, though, and libraries in particular, I mean, because I love using Polymer, and I started playing with Angular 2 now, and Aurelia. Do you think that it's too much overhead for them to put this stuff in? And one of the things I've found with some of this, like Polymer, which I love using, but sometimes I wonder if I could decouple things, if there was better performance if we implemented a lot of that natively, because I've been experiencing some pain with certain abstractions for specific elements that are not necessarily upgraded to a version of the framework or the library.
I think that's always the problem with frameworks, isn't it? We get the functionality right now, but we get it at the cost of being simulated. So it's up to the frameworks to stay up to date, and actually when it becomes natively supported, to use the native one rather than keep simulating it. And of course then it puts the onus on the people who use these frameworks to upgrade their frameworks, which sadly enough doesn't work a lot of times as well. So I think a framework is a great opportunity to feature these tests and to test these features and to kick the tires off them. And maybe that's something that we should be concentrating on a bit more, to actually make all the frameworks align and make the spec coming from that one, rather than like asking people to use it. Because when we did at EdgeConf, which is the cream of the crop in terms of developers, when we asked people who uses them natively, not a single one did. Then after my blog post, a lot of people started tweeting me and sending me emails that internally they're using native web components, but it was mostly in content management systems behind the scenes. So on runtime, a lot of people don't do them yet. So I agree that inside libraries is probably a good idea to actually test these features and find out the main solutions. As if Aurelia has a good solution for that and proposes it back to the spec, why not?
I've seen some components that are native, just regular web components, vanilla web components from IBM. It's the only web component group I've seen that's totally like that, that's out there for open source. But I mean, when I first started playing with web components a while ago, that's what I wanted to do, because that was the power of it, right? You're not depending on something else, and I feel like frameworks, it shouldn't have that burden to have to put that in there. But it is a good experimental ground. You bring up a good point. It makes
you wonder. I mean, like, if you a lot of web components are components, they're modules. They have a lot of stuff in them. So when you say, like, I don't want to use a lot of stuff, a lot of times you use a component and then it loads a lot of stuff in the background, lots of scripting. And we have, of course, the problem, if we had components across browsers, they probably would have jQuery in every single one of them, although it's already on the page, which is an issue. But inside the frameworks, as you say, my bigger problem is that we, instead of telling people you can use web components by using Polymer, by using React, by using Aurelia or whatever, we just tell people you start a new app. We start a new app by starting with that framework. So we make the frameworks a dependency rather than a helper. And I think that is where the weirdness comes in, because we get far too excited of pushing our products to people rather than like making the thing work in the browser.
Well, so one thing that
You're not talking. You're just beeping.
Okay, that's not just me. All right, good. I was about to say, I'm going crazy.
Well, you're working with web components. What do you expect?
Now it's devil sounds.
It's that WebRTC component again.
Is this better?
That's
Yes.
so
Okay,
much
cool.
better.
Yeah. So
You
one
don't
of the
sound
things.
like the one in like the it was like Attack of the Body Snatchers. You know, the like. Don't do that again.
I thought maybe it was these giant horns going off at this hackathon behind me, but yeah, no, when I look at from the library author perspective, I don't worry too much about the libraries, only because I hope that people are genuine, the browser vendors are genuine when they say that we want to innovate, based on what the community does and at a faster pace, because I see web components as a really good substrate. They're pretty basic right now as far as what a custom element does. It's just a lot of hooks that you didn't used to have. But I hope over time we start adding things like Christian talked about, the tap groups and all these other things, and it gives you a really good entry-level foundation for building what really needs to be the next sort of wave of what web apps are. And that's more complex design interactions and UI, and it can be based on web components. We can start adding, like people talk about React a lot in these frameworks. And my thing with React, I love the guys that work in React. I actually coded Mutual's core with Sebastian and those guys back in the day. So they're friends of mine. But I think to myself, maybe in the future we have web components, and then we take like the 3 or 4 core things out of React that are interesting and that do a good job, and we add them as add-ons to web components. And so no matter what, I still see it as a really good foundation. Does that make sense, or?
Kind of.
It makes sense to me. I mean, the thing is, the reason people build frameworks and libraries is because they see a deficiency in the core platform that relates to their real-world scenarios. I mean, and in our case, it's some of its capabilities that we feel that are missing, but some of it is actually really around the story of developer experience, or the process of how one puts together a large-scale app, or some of these other kinds of things, which maybe the browser tech maybe is never intended to solve, because these can be very opinionated type things. So there's a mixture of things. I think that I could see, what I would love to see happen at least, is as web components evolve, for people working on implementing and speccing to look out at the array of frameworks and saying, like, okay, what is being done well out there that is meeting a real-world need by developers? And is this something that is generally applicable that we could, maybe with some massaging, if you will, kind of reimagine on top of the native web stack? I mean, so I think that it makes a lot of sense to look at, what is React doing? What is Aurelia doing? What is Angular doing? Are there any pieces that are generally applicable, and could they or should they be folded back into the core platform? It's kind of a difficult line to walk, though, because also all these frameworks, like I said, they also have their own, usually have pretty strong opinions, and those go beyond core capabilities, but more into methodologies or approaches to app development or team culture, even. All those kind of philosophies about those things kind of are usually in the framework too. But I mean, I think that should definitely be the process. I mean, like I said with Aurelia, we use several of the web components technologies. We make several of them optionally usable, but we pretty much hack on top of all of them, because, like in our opinion, none of them are really quite right for building apps. The way that I've been building apps, and the way that our community has been building apps for years. So that's where the deficiencies come in, or whatnot, that we have to kind of patch up. But that should definitely feed back into the process. I don't know what that would look like or how that would happen. I think that's a good source of raw material, if you will, to be refined for the platform, for the real web platform itself.
I'm also pretty worried about this, because we speak a lot about like what we as developers need and what we as developers work like, and how we build apps for years. And when I then look at the state of the mobile web and the applications that we have out there, it's awful. It's like a lot of the performance is absolutely terrible. The things are much too big than what they should be. Could we use native functionality in the browser, because we just put it on top of a framework that made us feel better and made us say, like, we can build more. The question is, like, do we need to build more, or do we need to build better? Because I've seen, when I see, for example, a Facebook running in React, it's a massively complex thing to work, but the performance of it is just like on an older computer is terrible, and it's because we simulate in older browsers what the newer browsers have. So maybe an approach to have a simpler interface on older machines and a more complex one using progressive enhancement is something that makes sense. But I don't know any of the frameworks that do that, because it comes from here's how we would do it in Java, or here's how we would do it in .NET, and now we can do this on the web as well. And the end product, okay, we optimize it for you. Please trust us, our opinionated approach, that this is going to be the best app that you can have at the end. So we're kind of disengaged from the end product as developers by going through these things that make our lives easier. But I'm kind of worried that we're losing touch with the web that way, because we see it as a rendering platform, or as an end platform to render to, rather than something to build on.
Well, is this a blind spot for Chris? I mean, is it a blind spot for developers? Have we, so often before we had said, okay, well, I want to use feature X that's in the pipe. I'll use a polyfill. And now everyone seems to lean towards the framework, because I'm going to use this framework to resolve all my problems, which creates, in a lot of cases, slowness, because, one, it's a complex framework. They may not have a great deal of understanding straight away, which means you have to learn a framework and how to eke out every bit of performance. I mean, are we losing this notion of, I just want to polyfill this feature?
And I think even more that the frameworks themselves don't do polyfilling internally. Instead of just seeing what the platform is that it's running on, that it is an Edge browser or is it a Chrome, and then I don't need to use the polyfill, but I just use the native implementation. But that means making the framework much more complex as well. And most framework developers are busy just keeping the thing alive and putting new features in that people request. Again, that developers request and not end users request. So the problem with polyfilling is that, it's a British term that means you have a hole in the wall, you paint over it. So, but it should, in essence, you should fix that hole sooner or later. And polyfills had a tendency to stay around and not get updated and not get removed. And the same with PhoneGap. PhoneGap was meant to be a stopgap solution until the web has native capabilities, which the web never got. So we don't let things evolve inside the frameworks themselves. And I think this would be a massive change, and this would be a massive boost if we allowed inside frameworks to promote browsers better that actually do it, rather than just simulate it for everybody.
And now we just swizzle it all together.
Well, I can tell you that Aurelia definitely does do that. So we use every native capability that's present, or fall back to polyfills if it's not there. When we try and stay pretty much on top of everything, but
it's expensive. It costs a lot of man hours, doesn't it?
It's not too bad. It's not too bad. It's cheaper than, I don't know, because speaking of expensive and man hours, people may choose a framework because it fits well with the type of app they're building or their corporate culture, and it's going to allow them to be more agile, perhaps, than if they were building straight on top of the raw platform. And they know that I've only got a month to develop this or whatever. And, people choose these things for a lot of different reasons. Sometimes it's opinions, sometimes it's corporate culture, sometimes it's a matter of, we get people that contact us, for example, that are just building lots of line of business apps that are coming off of having a legacy, say, Silverlight app, that's 100,000 lines of C# code, and they're trying to figure out how to get off this dead platform and get to the web, and they're looking for higher level pieces because they're basically building things like forms over data and these kinds of apps. And so they're looking for higher level pieces. These kind of people are just trying to get to the web and get off of their legacy stuff, and they oftentimes don't even know anything about web components, to be honest. So you've got this wide range of people out there and companies in all these different situations that are coming from all these different perspectives. So obviously I'm a framework author, so I'm going to be pro-framework, but I think that it's unfair to say that they're not useful. even in a world where web components are on version 3, and the browser has evolved much more significantly than today, there's still going to be a good use for things like that because it aligns with the specific business needs, which may have nothing to do with core web tech per se.
So I wouldn't say it's not useful. I think my big thing with React anyway has been that initially, maybe a year ago, it was billed as, well, we don't need web components because we've got React. When really, when you break it down, like web components work just fine in React. You can have, components in React templates. And in my own working with stateless apps, a one-way state sort of app that's built like that, I have like a module I wrote that was like 100 lines. It does a lot of what Flux does, some of those core pieces of React. And I really like it, but I also like using web components inside it because there's no reason you can't create a generic unit of functionality and have it used within your one-way bound app. So I think it was like a needless positioning to say it has to be one and not the other, or you just choose React because you don't need web components with it. When really it's like React is kind of good at these other things, and web components marry nicely with it. So I don't know if it was a branding thing or if it just happened that way, but it pushed people off the idea that we need to innovate on that part of the web, those slow paths and those things that are crafty, because we can just throw a glob of divs at it, and that's going to be fast as long as we just ignore the platform, right? Like the way to get around these speed things and these bottlenecks is not to say, well, let's just work in this one little environment we have in script that we know is fast and tuned, and we'll just completely avoid that, and we'll encourage everyone else to write this React Native stuff that treats the web as a dumb target, and that we don't have to improve in certain areas. And that was, I guess, what I was most opposed to. And what I
would agree.
Yeah.
It's a branding marketing problem, isn't it? A lot of people use frameworks to make Hacker News. So yeah, if I build it on top of that, then people are excited about my product because it's obviously the new thing and the amazing thing. I'm getting very tired of this, and I think it's a very big problem that we have right now. And I'm talking tomorrow at the Web Forward event here about this to a degree, that we got into a world where we impress each other with the things that we do rather than thinking about the end product. And every framework or every solution and every polyfill that comes out has to fix every problem. Like when we go back to say, like, you have different constituencies, you have different people that are just having data or forms over data and want to go on the web. Yeah, this framework will work for those guys and for the ones who want to build a blog and for the ones who want to build a to-do list and for the ones and so on and so on. I think we should think much more as a tool chain of different solutions to get where we want to go, rather than like every single time a new framework comes out, it's just like that's the end of necessity of web components or web standards, because now you can only start use things with that. And when I look at a JSX file, for example, it scares me having like the HTML, the look and feel and the functionality in the same file. That's, if you write that in HTML, people would slap you. But if it's as it's pre-rendered, it's a cool thing out of a sudden. And we've done that with .NET, we've done that with other platforms, and it keeps that, like, if you modularize into includes, then it's a better way of doing it, because the whole CSS cascade and stuff is confusing, and global scoping is a real problem. So we still haven't fixed the scoping problem of web components at all. And I think that's something we should revisit, because it is beneficial for the web.
Scoping is for me anyways, a huge deal in web components. And like Rob was saying, where you have to build on top of these other things to actually fit your real-world scenarios. That's a big one. We touched on it a little bit before, but everything being in the global scope it inevitably is going to cause you problems, especially as you start building larger apps, and you're like, things are happening somewhere, and I don't know what's happening, which is why just things like modules, common JS and require now, ES6 with Babel or Tracer or something like that are so important to have. To me, it's an unavoidable problem that's going to have to be solved at some point.
I mean, you can't do document.getElementById.register element, right? That would be great if you could just scope it to another element, and then it's inside there. Anything you put inside there, you could do, or even some shadow root.
Isn't that the same problem we have with JavaScript, though? Because with JavaScript, everything was global as well, and then we came up with functional patterns, then we came up with module patterns, then revealing module patterns, then we came up with namespacing, and then jQuery had the jQuery problem that every plugin tried to override another plugin with the same name. In essence, it's like there's no technical solution for that. It's just craft. It's like making sure that you actually know the naming of stuff that goes into it, and in a build process, if there's a name clash, do some renaming or some refactoring on the fly. That would be another solution to that problem.
That very well might be the solution, is to do it in tooling rather than in the platform itself. But
that doesn't really work though when you get mashup apps and you get these dynamically composited apps. And if you're looking at down the future of the web, and how can you even know ahead of time in some cases what is going to be there? So I think that that's a core platform issue. I mean, the ECMA body has spent a lot of work on ES6, and one of the big features of ES6 was going through to finally get modularization in the language. And to me, it seems that we should take that same concept and bring it into the DOM somehow, officially, and that should be a core platform feature, because that's a fundamental enabler. I guess you could do a bit of it with tooling. I don't think writing that tool would be very trivial. And again, writing such a tool would probably be framework dependent, because you have to kind of make some assumptions about how people are putting their apps together. But I think it would be better served in the platform and be able to handle a much more robust set of scenarios, particularly, like I said, when you have these mashups and when you have things that are a lot more dynamic in terms of what actually ends up in the DOM at runtime. Maybe it's not all statically, knowable, so to speak. So in my opinion, I think there's been a lot of work done on JavaScript lately. I think that we should learn from them and see if any of what is in what has happened with ES6 and what is sort of ongoing into the future there, we should learn from them and see if any of those concepts or any of those developments make sense in the DOM world. Like imports, the ES6 module loader, and scoping, and there's other things too. But I mean, I think that's a easily identifiable one. And
It's
again,
a lot of work.
I'm not saying it's not a lot of work, but I think it's important.
No, there's a lot of work in JavaScript engines themselves to do optimization of JavaScript before the rendering in the JITs itself. There's, for example, at the Edge Summit, we had a talk about Brian Terland about the Chakra engine, and he showed about inlining of JavaScript, that when you have a function that is actually called from another function internally, the JIT takes that function and makes it part of the other one, so you have one binary blob in the end. And if you put that across different import into different scripts, then it didn't work in the past, and now the new Chakra engine does that as well. So a lot of the implementation in JavaScript engines itself, like in Odin Monkey or whatever it's called in Microsoft, in Mozilla now, and in Chakra and in V8, would be interesting to take a look at that and see if we optimize too much in our implementation and not let the JIT take over for these optimizations, because a lot of the modularization of JavaScript that we did in the past worked against making it fast on runtime. So it would be interesting to promote this kind of knowledge much more to the outside world and to the average JavaScript developer before they actually start trying to solve a problem that after the fact the browser will solve for them anyways.
Chris, in your last article, you had a great quote that was, "We need to enable web developers to use vanilla web components," right? So Can you talk about that? Because to me, it just seems like we're moving away from that right now.
Well, it's basically because I'm old and I've been using the web for such a long time. And I came from Ribeiro, and I started using the web with Notepad and started writing things and looked at the specs and just started typing things in, and things worked. And that was amazing. And I've been coaching and training people for the last 15 years. Here's how easy it is to get something started on the web, and not like here's your C++ builder, or here's like your Visual Studio, and then you have the C#, and here's 5,000 lines of code with 50 dependencies, and out of a sudden you have something on the screen. So the immediacy of web development to me was always a big success. Everybody become a publisher on the web. I think it's very dangerous when people say everybody needs to learn how to code. And I think if we, in 2016, 2015, you still have to learn how to code to publish something on the web, I think that we regressed. We regressed as a medium. We didn't regress as a technology platform, but as a medium we have a problem, because this is for people who want to put things out there and get people excited about what they do. This could be an app, this could be a blog post, this could be a political statement when you're in Syria and the rest of the media is controlled by somebody. So making it very complex for people to use things that perform well and to things that work well is something that I don't subscribe to. I'm not coming from a computer science background. I'm not coming from a university background. To me, the more abstractions we put in, the less people we have using that thing. It doesn't matter if it's beautiful in the end, if it looks easy, but people are not happy relying on magic or relying on things that they don't understand. And that's why I think we should try to push more forward to make this thing work without any of these abstractions. But as I said earlier, if in the abstractions we can learn from it and kick the tires inside these abstractions, all the better. But sooner or later, I think we should stop relying on them, because no matter how much these things are supported right now, sooner or later, when the business case of a company changes, they might drop and fall through. And I can show the battle scars of that because I worked on YUI. YUI 2, YUI 3 was an amazing, amazing platform. It had modelization, it had like independent parts of the page that were scoped to each other, because we needed it for the Yahoo homepage back then, because Yahoo Finance had a different look and feel that Yahoo Sports had, that the Maps had, and every team wanted to have their part of the homepage independent of the others. So YUI 3 had this modularization and lazy loading and all these clever things in it. And nowadays, where is YUI? It's not even supported by Yahoo anymore. It's now thrown out to the community and say like, oh, please, the community will maintain it. And communities don't maintain things if you don't guide them and you don't pay them and you don't make them feel welcome for maintaining it. You just get a few people who are very excited or very involved in it. So I think relying on frameworks, shims, and libraries is good to get immediate results. But we should push forward to making this thing work. And I found we lost that a bit after we've been rah-rahing it a long time for web components. It's funny because I'm at conferences almost every week, and I see this like schedule of talks and like the talk topics, and the whole web components topic has spiked in the last few years, and now it's getting less and less. And all the talks I see about web components, native web components right now, is all about it doesn't work. We don't have the excitement anymore that we had before, and I think we should push harder to make that excitement happen again.
How do we do that? So I know that's kind of it's a terrible question, and I apologize for it almost, but at the same point, I would love to be able to use native components at work now, but I can't. Based on project requirements and all these other things, I can't. So if I want to use these things, I have to go somewhere else to get them. I have to go to something like Polymer or X or Y other things. I have to go that way. So how do we? So how do we get back up to the same levels of excitement without saying it doesn't work? And will that also help push more browser vendors? I mean, Safari is a big one now, where with a roadmap for native support for web components. If more people in the developer community are talking about native vanilla components, will that help push the browser vendors to start implementing these things natively faster, the way that ES6 is starting to be pushed now?
I think it's mostly about wording, and I'm very happy that we have somebody from Apple here discussing all these we don't. I think the bigger issues are wording about these kind of things, like use React, use Polymer, and everything works, and look how beautiful the design is, and like how your components work. We keep selling that dream of like, here's the thing, and it works, and you don't have to worry about it. And instead, it would be interesting to see a few more talks. We did this with Polymer, and under the hood, it creates these web components that could be natively used like this as well, to show that these frameworks are being used to solve a current problem and not to replace a problem that is already we gave up on. I think a lot of the messaging that we give right now is like, it will not work ever without this kind of framework, and here's why I'm excited about this framework, and here's how fast we build something with it. So that's the kind of wording that I would love to see go away. And but it's all marketing if you think about it. It's great for somebody like Facebook to have React. It's great for somebody like Google to have Polymer. It's great for people. It was the same with YUI. I mean, YUI was a great opportunity for us to hire people, because they hit the ground running. They basically used the system that we used internally in Yahoo before they actually got hired. And I think with React and with Polymer, you have exactly the same thing. But we cannot expect people to use that one thing. That's the same thing that we thought with Flash and Silverlight. These machineries solved all of our problems. You could build beautiful things with a click of a button, and then half a year later, you had these like threads of people who are like, oh my God, I'm now totally given up. I mean, the amount of very hurt Flash developers shooting at HTML5 every day because they've been abandoned by Adobe is huge, and I think that's partly understandable. I don't want to disappoint developers by saying like, okay, this works now, and then a week later, oh no, don't use that because it's actually not a solution anymore. So I think giving the insight of how these frameworks would relate to native ones, and maybe doing some comparison and say like, okay, with React or with Polymer, this is how this app performs. In Chrome, where all this stuff is supported, with a native one, this is how that one performs. And if the native one is better, that would be an interesting thing for people to push browser makers to actually get more involved into implementing them.
I think it's hard for developers too, because they want to get into some of these concepts and these new things that are happening, but then they look at Polymer, and Polymer has been tested, and they have tooling around it so that you can build applications for production. You can build applications with Xtag, and it lowers the boilerplate, it lowers the barrier of entry. But yeah, I mean, using those native things, having like vanilla components, you can 10 years from now, it's still going to work the way that it was. It not dependent on a version. It's not dependent on a library. It's not dependent on a framework. It's just going to be there.
It's the old problem of like, why should I use clean HTML? The browser fixes it for me anyways. Everything could be a div and it works. Why should I use headlines? Why should I use input elements? Why should a button be a button? It works in my browser, doesn't it? And that longevity, as you said, from 10 years from now it will work, is something that is a good message. But I think for busy new developers and people who just want to build things, that messaging really doesn't work. Like a 17-year-old kid that wants to roll out the next page to win TechCrunch with is not going to get interested what's going to happen in 10 years' time with their application, because most of them will be gone.
The vanilla interoperability thing is super important. Like, if at the end of the day, if I'm using X tags or something and I want to use a Polymer component, I'm probably not going to use it because it then means I have to have Polymer on my page, and that's extra script paths, and it's just overhead for me. So I think where web components will really flourish is where we start to, aside from what framework you decide to use to assemble your web application, you can just pull these high quality components off the shelf, and they'll just work within your workflow. I think we're kind of approaching it as I think that web components are only useful to build frameworks on top of is kind of the wrong angle to be looking at this from. And to your point, talking about what Chris was saying, how we need to make the components easier to write, I think there's two audiences I see for web components. There's the authors, who will be probably very professional developers producing very high quality components that want to share their work with as many people as possible. And then you get users who are maybe just writing their first web page or their first web app that can now start to write very high quality applications with just declaratively assembling HTML on their page from components that have been written by very experienced developers. So I always see there's two audiences to this, and I think it's interesting to see how we can help the web flourish by satisfying those two audiences.
One thing I really got excited about were the Polymer components that are like a Google login or a Google map, like the data-driven ones. Because this is something that, if a Facebook like button were some random HTML or some random JavaScript include but were a web component, that would be an interesting thing for people to start getting into it and understanding that these things are around. Like something that is in use all over the web. And it's funny because, I mean, when we talked about it, the only use of web components or custom elements that people keep quoting is the datetime element inside GitHub, which is like, whoopee-doo, well done, like what? So, but with somebody like a like button or a Twitter button being a web component, that would be a good advertisement for web components.
I'll tell you, that was very early on 3 years ago when we started the meetings with Dimitri and, Alex and all those guys over at Google. That was actually the #1 use case that they were trying to solve. They brought it up as like it was horrendous. Their performance teams were like looking at it and seeing like 50 nested iframes inside of a little HTML that stands for a Facebook like button, and all sorts of craziness that goes on. And it was actually that need to solve, and then it also brought up the idea of the encapsulation. You talked about the script encapsulation that I think Apple has been really, really pushing for, with allowing a enclosed, impermeable barrier to script scope, and that was another reason why they were thinking that was important. So yeah, it's funny you mentioned that.
Yeah, it's like on custom elements IO. When I remember when I first looked at it, there was like less than 100 on there, and there was a lot of them were those buttons, right, in different variants.
Well, the problem with the Facebook like button is if you got to have more use cases for designing a web component spec than that, because if that is utterly trivial to implement, give me 5 minutes, to implement this, right?
Yeah.
So this
fighting words.
So this is like a web. But then my point is that this is a simple web component to implement. So yes, you can absolutely do this on top of the vanilla web component spec today, very easily. But what about the person that wants to build like the data grid with sortable columns and all this kind of stuff? Yes, you can do it on top of vanilla web components, but it is a lot of work, and there are a number of features probably missing from the web component spec that would make building these more complex types of components much easier if they were there.
Another thing I've noticed too is people will build these giant components and not think to separate pieces. Like if I'm thinking of a data grid, I'm thinking of cells, I'm thinking of columns, I'm thinking of these separate pieces.
Absolutely, but you don't use the cell outside of a grid. So yeah, you modularize your component in that way for sure, but people use the whole thing together. But people, now I bring this up because this is the most highly requested component that we receive as a community. People are ready to throw money, ridiculous amounts of money at us for the data grid component. And so I bring it up because this is an example of a real-world component that is non-trivial, that there are tens of thousands of businesses out there that want.
And we have lots of widget libraries that try to break that problem already and ran into lots of performance problems on the web. I mean, using .NET, YUI Grid, Sencha, all of these things have these kind of components and are not simple. But I think this is kind of a defeatist. I mean, I understand where you're coming from.
No, my point is that the specs need to be designed to account for, if you're really going to build a component model for the web, you're going to have to be able to handle the like me button, but you're also going to have to be able to handle the data grid and everything in between. I don't think that even vanilla web components is, I mean, the problem with vanilla web components is you can't use them without a polyfill anyways. The second problem is that they're actually already really complicated. If you look at Shadow DOM is enormously complicated already. And so we've got something we can't use in every browser, but that if we could, it's enormously complicated, but still does not meet the needs of a lot of these real-world scenarios. So that's my issue. I think we need to basically get some use cases, and we need to start trying to build things, and we need to see where does it fall down.
But this is what we just had. I mean, the question was like, how can we make them more visible? And I say like, okay, when you say like a like button is very simple to implement, why does nobody do it? Like, if we don't have
maybe
these
because
things
it's
out
too
there,
simple. I don't know.
If we don't have these things out there, then we will never get to the question of the grid implementation in web components, because people never think of these solutions. They keep using their Sencha UI or XJS or these kind of things to do grid components with that. And
those developers have a deadline to meet to build an app. I mean, what you need is a set of developers that have no budgetary constraints. They can just sit around and build things for the heck of it. So the majority of people out there have a timeline that they have to, it's the real world. I got to be released in 3 weeks. I need a data grid, or I needed this. So like, I don't have time to play around with this.
So I think we're kind of combining several things though, right? Like I look at your ask, which I actually have felt a similar need for, basically a Pinterest list, right? We have uneven height columns, but that is actually projects the elements LTR instead of top to bottom. Right, like to me, we have CSS columns right now, and that has the look of exactly what I want, except if I'm having a time-ordered list, it lists things like this. so it doesn't work, right? But that's not a components problem. That's a CSS and layout problem that we can solve completely separate from components. So I don't want to pack everything in and say everything is a web components issue that might actually be an issue of we don't have the proper style, we have the proper style API.
I agree. You know, like, a lot of these things overlap.
So I get what you're saying. Let's call out the component use cases because the components call out the use case, right? I need a Pinterest list. And to me, to a top-level developer, you're going to think that's the component. And what we need to do is have the browser vendors digest that top-level need and say, oh, you know what? They want a Pinterest list. What that really is we already have the hooks on the component side for like the life cycle, but we need to give them the style APIs they need to be able to fulfill that layout, right? And so I think that's actually the missing piece. We are not doing a use case driven approach for dissecting the needs for the lower level platform for like the extend the web forward and the manifesto that we have out now to be able to give people low level unblack boxed APIs. We need to do more of that from a use case driven perspective. But to put it all into the web components bucket kind of unduly encumbers the basic APIs we need to just get out there to make web components work.
Yeah, because I mean, when web components were first introduced by Google like 3 years ago, the spec was massive, right? We had like a huge shadow DOM spec. We had spec for multiple shadow routes. We had custom elements. We had HTML imports. We had the template tag. We had the MDV thing that didn't end up getting spec. Like there was so much stuff. And then Apple took one look at it, like all the other vendors took one look, like, whoa, we're not implementing. What the hell is this? This is so much stuff. Like, so over the last 3 years, and especially the last 6 months, we've seen the specs being reined in and like distilled down to the absolute essence. And they need to be at the absolute essence in order for us to get agreement from these vendors. If we don't get agreement from these vendors, it's always just going to be Chrome that ships them. And then we're in the situation where no one jumps on board and starts playing with it. So our job now is just to really cut away everything and just deliver the pieces that will really, really empower the community. So Shadow DOM is one thing that's finally reached consensus between Mozilla, Microsoft, Google, and Apple. Have all said, okay, we agree on this direction for Shadow DOM. And for me, that's like Shadow DOM is the most important piece of web components. It provides something that cannot be polyfilled and provides features that will really change the way our development works. We're still hacking out custom elements, but that's something that can be polyfilled.
Do you think tooling would help there? Because, I mean, the Shadow DOM problem was always that, like, it was this thing that people didn't know. And when developer tools started allowing me to dive into a video element and see the shadow root of it, then developers started understanding much more what's going on there, rather than telling them, you can create your own element inside the other element, but did you even know what a select box looked like in the browser and what under the hood was created? So
yeah, I think it's a really powerful tool for getting people excited. One of the things that comes up time and time again in spec meetings is like, let's explain the platform. Like, let's explain how the select box is done. Let's explain how the video tag is done. And that's one of the reasons why, going back to, like I said earlier, the synchronous constructor thing and using Shadow DOM for native controls. So I think that's super important. Yeah. And if we can, if developers can inspect stuff and go, that's how the browsers make the slider components, the range input. They'd be like, yeah, I can do that too. And it seems like it works for them, so it should work for me type thing. I think that's a powerful message.
One of the Google developer experts, Conrad, created this dev tools thing that'll watch custom elements. So it's pretty cool. So I think there's developers out there that are doing some interesting stuff with that. Do you think that the community can do more? What can we do to help, drive more awareness and support for this?
I think all we need right now is buy-in from vendors. We need people to you're only going to use a polyfill if you can see the light at the end of the tunnel, right? You're like, I'll use this polyfill because it's a short-term thing, and this thing will be landing in the next, I don't know, 6 months.
So the vendors first, and then the community
and I think,
start to help more.
Because when everyone was speaking about web components, like Christian was talking about, they were on every conference track, and everyone was talking about them. And the promise is like 2-3 years later, the promise has just failed to be fulfilled. So everyone's just like, oh, screw that. I was super excited 2 years ago, but now I've given up on it. So then it's going to be hard to regain that trust. But once developers can rely on this technology, we'll see some interesting things come out, and we'll see web components arriving in the wild, and then that will slowly regain the trust, and then I think we'll see people start to use them more. But it all hinges on this: can we just get the core API? All we need really is Shadow DOM and custom elements everywhere, and then we can start to see people creating some really cool things.
I would love to see some talks about people analyzing what's in the browser with developer tools and showing the shadow root of a video element, for example. Or like, as you said, a range component. You know, we had a big success in YUI when we gave talks about like how we did a slider component and how we actually chose the different parts of it and how it was built. Having inside talks about how browsers internally use Shadow DOM, I think is one that I haven't seen much. A lot of it was like, yeah, now I created a super button that inherits from another button, and it's now a green background. Well done. But like showing how a range or a select box works would be an interesting thing to tell people, because a lot of people assume that you can build these things, and they're not easy. They're really not easy to build components in the browser that way. So getting more insight into that one would be a new a renaissance of web components talks, I think, rather than just like promises, as you said, like, oh, this will be the future, learn it now, and then it didn't become the future.
So one of the interesting things in Firefox is that we're not yet using web components for the browser internals. We're using something called XBL, which I only found out recently was actually what the web component spec was built on. So XBL is like a markup language very similar to HTML. It has JavaScript and stuff, and all the concepts of Shadow DOM and custom tags were already part of this language called XBL. XBL2 was spec'd, and actually Dimitri then based the whole web component spec on top of XBL2, which I didn't know about. So what we have inside Firefox is like real use cases of how web components will be used, but in XBL. And then we have people who have actually a lot of experience using these not web components, but web components in production, and they're coming to the spec meetings and saying this does work, this doesn't work. So that's really good to have that feedback. And then the dream is if once we get this web component spec'd out fully, then we can replace these XBL parts with real HTML, JavaScript, CSS, and we can have the same inspect story that Chrome has.
It's a bit like in Flash and in Flex, we had all these kind of things, and a lot of these learnings have been lost. And because of like religious wars of like open web versus Flash, it's a kind of a shame that kind of these thinkings were not there. Or it would be an interesting one to take, for example, all the data grids of all the widget libraries and analyze all of them and see like how hard it would be to actually turn that into a native web component. You know, these kind of things would be interesting to analyze what people are using right now and how much that would work for a specified one or a standardized one.
So I guess the main point that I would want to get across is there was a big hype about web components and everybody was just really excited at the beginning. I think it's because there's universal agreement about the concept of web components. Everybody thinks this is a good idea. Everybody wants this. But I still believe that there are a lot of problems in the implementations and the specifications. And so, in my opinion, I think that in the last, if I had to guess, the reason it's fallen off is because people finally have started to dig in and realize that, oh my goodness, it's harder than I thought it was going to be, or oh, I thought it was going to have, for example, oh, I thought it was going to have feature X, and it doesn't, and so then they get maybe less excited because they realize there's still a lot of hard work, or there's just platform things obstructing them. I have a very long list of my own personal problems with all of the specs, which we don't have time to go into, but I had a few big picture issues I'd like to just enunciate.
Do you have any examples?
Let me just do a few high-level things, because I think, in my opinion, I'm all for web components, but I feel like it's probably worth it to take a step back and try and address more general issues with the DOM. As a primary example, say you've got Shadow DOM and you want to implement your web component. That's all fine and good. You can do that. But the layout engine of the browser is still a black box. And oftentimes you want your web component to render itself different, not based off of the screen size, not based off of current media queries, but based off of how much space it has for itself alone. I mean, this is just, if I think about a component model, again, this has nothing to do with the current web component specs, But when I think about building components, if I'm going to build a truly reusable component, my component needs to be able to render itself, and its layout logic needs to sort of be encapsulated. It can't be dependent on the screen size because the developer may have chosen to put it in a 50 by 50 box instead of a 300 by 300 box or a full page box, and it has nothing to do with the media, if you will. It has nothing to do with whether I'm running on a tablet per se. It has to do with its ability to render in the space that it's given. So, for example, this is an example of a fundamental problem just around CSS and the DOM, with the fact that the rendering, the layout engine of the browser is completely a black box, and the only way to get into that is by extending CSS with more and more and more box models. There's no way to tap into any kind of feature that says I want to lay out different based on my available space or any of this kind of thing. I mean, there's proposals for element queries, but it's not in there. But so to me, this is not to do with the current set of web component specs, but this is like a core DOM, a CSS-ish type feature that actually relates very, very strongly to be able to successfully create web components that actually can be reused in a variety of different applications. So I
it
think
sounds like the problem you're explaining is the problem that the Houdini project is trying to solve, which is actually delving into how can we explain CSS, how can we get people to extend CSS,
right?
Which is it's a really hard problem to solve because that black box is exactly how it makes it easy for us to spec stuff. You can just say, this is the syntax, and this is how it should do, how it should.
I'm not disagreeing with that, but now I'm saying, okay, let's think about people that are going to write web components, and
so
they have to render, and they don't know where they're rendering at. You know, they don't know. Yeah. That's just a part of writing a truly reusable component. So I would say let's think about how can we give people access to the layout engine in some way that they can actually encapsulate their components from that perspective. I think things like accessibility, like we need better accessibility APIs just in the core platform so that people can build these web components that don't have to inherit from some built-in component in order to get the proper accessibility behavior. So like we need to, and this is again, it's not part of the web component spec, but this is just a general improvement that would be fantastic for the DOM as a whole.
That was one of my main disappointments, because I totally loved the idea of inheriting from a button and making it to something else and getting all the accessibility goodness of a button inside your component. And then this is now being dropped, the is equals whatever subclassing, because it's a hard thing to implement. But I think you're getting into like from 10 to 10,000 to 100,000 here. Like, I mean, we will not be able to fix the DOM and the CSS and replace it with something else retroactively for all the browsers out there. At times, we have something that is already rolled out there, and some parts of the component you will have a hard time to re-implement. Also, I'm not quite sure if we really have that many developers really excited to start writing their own CSS and rendering, or wanting to know how a thing renders. The only thing that developers are worried about is that their stuff renders slowly on the web, and we have to fix that. And instead of just, I mean, if you want to go into rendering, you can actually write parts of the browser, or you can write WebGL, or you can write OpenGL. Then you have directly access to the video hardware and all these kind of features. So I'm really wondering if, like, I'm not saying that this is not important things. They are very important things. I just wonder who the audience of that is. Like, we have millions of web developers out there who would benefit from being able to actually put components into their pages that do more than HTML5 has, or to have like their company header with the links and the buttons and everything, and put that into a custom element that a CMS, for example, could then use as one element, rather than just having to have it as like 10,000 div elements and changing it accordingly when every new browser comes out. So the componentization on the platform itself is something that we stop talking about, and we get more excited into like, how do we replace the DOM, how do we replace CSS because it's all broken? Yes, it is, but it's also all distributed.
I'm not talking about replacing any of that, but I'm talking about, don't we have missing features in terms of accessibility, and wouldn't that be great for not just web component scenarios, but a whole host of just general web development? But wouldn't that make web components better as well? So shouldn't we look at improving the accessibility APIs? Shouldn't we look at improving layout, at least with something maybe like element queries?
Yeah.
So
these
that
are all these
yeah.
are like parallel tracks. These are
No,
parallel.
but this is my point. So I guess my point is when you go to design web components, you might design them differently if the core platform actually had some of these features that are not there yet that would actually benefit not only web components but a broader range of scenarios. Better integration with ES6. Reimagine web components with ES6 as a baseline. Reimagine web components with the accessibility APIs. Reimagine them with some new layout features. And these features in the core DOM, improving the core DOM, would affect many more scenarios, but would also make for a better web component spec as well. I mean, building web components on top of that would be better. I mean,
we had, for example, the widget specification, which allows you to build applications on terms of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that ran outside the browser. Opera used them since Opera 5 or something like that. We had HTAs in Internet Explorer 4. We had like all these things we tried that so many times, and I think it's a very important part, and you're very much right with the accessibility APIs. One of the things we're pushing inside the team here right now is we wrote a polyfill for the outline algorithm of the browser, because nobody uses that one. Like having H1 to H6 and having sections and articles and these kind of things, no browser does anything with that outline algorithm. That's why people don't write a semantic HTML, because there's no benefit from it. And the same with you, that when you say, like, if we had a richer way to interact with things with accessibility, for example, if your component could get voice input, if your component could have proper voice output, these kind of, the Cortana APIs, for example, being available in JavaScript right now, something like that as a specified part of a component spec would be interesting. But that goes, as Wilson said, as Owen said, that's actually going into parallel tracks, because the other thing, of course, is like hardware APIs is the other big thing as well. Like if your component can do things like an image upload without having to write it, great. This would be a very simple thing to do. A drag and drop into a file upload. The file upload component is terrible at the moment. Like it doesn't have chunked uploads, it doesn't have timed uploads, these kind of things. These would be things that are very nice to do. I still am wondering about the question, like it's 3 years have gone and we cannot use the web components yet the way they are. Is it time to admit defeat and say, like, okay, the specification was too grandiose, was too complex? Or is, as you said, should we rethink it? And it was just solving a problem that we didn't really have, and people didn't jump on because it was too hard to implement natively right now. And maybe it's a good opportunity now to open that even wider and say, like, what about the accessibility of it? What about the extensibility of it? What about taking ES6 as the baseline? But then, of course, we have to make ES6 better and more.
Let's be clear that for the first time in 3 years, we actually have buy-in from all 4 major vendors. That's something that would explain why we haven't had these things adopted. So I think.
Yeah, I guess at some point you have to ship, though, right? At some point you have to draw a line in the sand and say, we have to try something, otherwise the platform never moves.
I guess it just seems kind of ridiculous to me to have ES6 and then to have a component model based off of ES5, you know? I mean, every browser that's going to have web components is already going to have the ES6 features by the time they roll out, probably, right? I mean,
are you referring to modules?
Yeah, modules and classes are the primary 2 obvious things. I mean, I know that there is some consideration around that now, but back to the HTML imports issue, I mean, it just seems silly not to integrate that with the ES6 module loader. I mean,
so imports are kind of, no other vendor other than Google has bought in for import, has buy-in for imports. So
right.
The imports they're not spec'd, they're just a proposal from Google, and people have like rolled quite far with them, but we haven't seen any other vendor interested in them yet, so I'm not sure where they go now. We're just looking at custom elements and Shadow DOM. That's the only thing.
There was a patch for Mozilla that didn't land, right, for imports?
Yeah, so
tracker, but but there was a design choice, right? You guys made a design choice.
Yeah, that was actually one of the reasons why we backed away from imports, is because there was just so many holes in the spec. It was just, I don't know, it was riddled with problems, and we decided to take a step away, go and discuss them, actually seeing if they solved problems that users needed, that normal JS wouldn't solve. And in the effort to distill this stuff right back and actually get buy-in from everyone, it was one of the easiest things to drop and it didn't seem like it enabled anything that couldn't already be done. So that was one of the things.
All right, we are pushing up against time. I'm sorry. Maybe we could do a second one of these, because I know Rob has a ton more stuff, which would be great to get to. So
I'll write a blog post. I have a huge list of beefs with different specs.
all
That's
right.
good.
So,
Blog posts are good. Don't just write a tweet and tell people to fix it. Blog posts are good. Explain things.
yeah.
I've got blog posts and presentations at conferences lined up on this very topic. It'll be out there, trust me. It might not enthuse people to use web components, so sorry about that. But maybe
it's
it'll
good to
motivate.
get different. It's good to get different opinions on it, though. I mean, we need that in the web community, right? If everybody thought the same, we wouldn't be having these discussions.
I think it's beautiful that we're at the end of the hype curve of web components right now. Like the marketing spiel doesn't work anymore. People are not believing the thing that it is the future that already works because you need to use one browser in a pre-built alpha so you can actually use them. And now we're actually in the stage where we can discuss how to make that thing really work. And I wish that hype curve with a lot of technologies that we use like that dies much, much quicker. Because right now we have this competition to be on Hacker News and to be like on Reddit and Stack Overflow and win everything and be the coolest thing ever. And then a half a year later we start actually thinking about like, hey, how does that actually work and how can we use it? We get far too excited about impressing each other with like, as I said in one talk, I remember when JavaScript didn't start with a logo. And nowadays it actually does. Like everything has a logo and a great branding, and it's just a polyfill for a little problem. And I wish we would stop trying to impress one another and actually think about more implementing it. And that's where I'm agreeing with Rob that it's a good decision to think about, like, why don't we paste it on ES6? Every new API that comes on the browser right now is promises-based. That already assumes an ES6 support. So why not think about that one? But again, I don't want to lose the simplicity of the original implementation of web components. I don't want to lose the writing an element to actually use the component. I just don't want that to be another JavaScript interface that you have to know a lot of class-based JavaScript to actually start writing your own first component, because that wouldn't make it useful.
Well, Chris, if people want to find you, what's your Twitter?
CodePoet, CODEPO number 8.
And Rob?
Eisenberg Effect.
And Wilson?
I'm Wilson Page. PAGE.
All right. Well, thank you guys for coming. Sorry we got a jet, but I appreciate it.
Thanks very much. Have a lovely day.
Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
You want to learn more about what's coming on next on the Web Platform Podcast? Follow us on Twitter at the Web Platform, or on Google Plus and YouTube at Plus the Web Platform. We also need your help in creating transcripts of the episodes and helping to create open source projects under our GitHub organization. Contact Erik Isaksen at eIsaksen
or Danny Blue at D_Blue. That's DEE_BLOO.
Thank you for listening, everybody, and we'll catch you all next week.